There are moments in life when a stranger's kindness changes everything, not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but with something as simple as a sack of flour left in a wagon bed. This is a story from the Nebraska prairie in 1883, when drought had turned the land hard and unforgiving, when a woman's worth was measured by the ring on her finger, and when one cowboy carrying the weight of his past learned that redemption doesn't always come with trumpets and glory. Sometimes it comes quiet as dust settling after a wagon passes. Sometimes it starts with 14 cents and a brooch that belonged to someone's mother. This is about two people who found each other in the space between shame and hope, in a place where the only thing growing was the distance between what they'd lost and what they might become. Sarah's hands shook as she lined up the pennies on the counter. 1, 2, 3. She counted them twice, fingers pressing each coin flat against the worn wood, like she could make them multiply through sheer will. The general store smelled of sawdust and coffee beans, of leather, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in glass jars she couldn't afford to look at. 14 cents. Bread cost 15. Mrs. Brennan stood behind the counter, her face kind, but her eyes carrying that particular sadness women get when they watch another woman fall. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The store had gone quiet in that way places do, when everyone's pretending not to notice something shameful. Sarah felt the stairs like spider webs on her neck. The cluster of ranch wives near the fabric bolts. The two men by the tobacco display. Even the store cat had stopped licking its paw to watch. Her throat went tight. She reached up with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else and unpinned the cameo brooch from her collar. The last thing her mother had given her before the fever took her, before James, before Nebraska, before everything turned to dust. The brooch clicked against the counter. "For the bread," Sarah said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd meant it to. "And the difference. Keep it for next time." Mrs. Brennan's hand hovered over the brooch, touched it, drew back. "Sarah, I can't. Please." That one word cost her everything. Pride, dignity, the last small piece of herself she'd been holding on to since James had sent his letter saying he'd found someone else, someone whose father owned land, someone who wasn't broken. Mrs. Brennan's mouth pressed into a thin line. She picked up the brooch, looked at it, set it down again. "You take the bread," she said quietly. "The brooch. You come back for it when things are better." Sarah's eyes burned. She nodded. Couldn't speak. Took the wrapped loaf and walked out before the tears could fall where people could see. Wade had been standing at the dry goods shelf for 10 minutes, pretending to examine tobacco he couldn't afford. He'd watched the whole thing, watched her count those pennies with hands that shook just enough to make the coins click against each other, watched her fingers work the pin free from that brooch, watched the way her shoulders went tight when she said, "Please." He knew that particular kind of shame. Knew what it cost to beg for what you needed to survive. He'd worn it himself for 3 years after Ellen died, after he'd lost the farm in Missouri, after he'd drifted west with nothing but a horse and the kind of guilt that sat in your chest like a stone. The store had been full of whispers lately about Sarah Merrick, the woman who'd come west to marry that banker's son in Lincoln, the woman who'd gotten a letter a week before the wedding saying he'd found someone else, the woman who'd been too ashamed to go home to Ohio and too poor to stay anywhere decent. Wade looked at the brooch on the counter, at Mrs. Brennan's face, at the door Sarah had just walked through. He set down the tobacco pouch, walked to the counter. "Need some supplies," he said. Mrs. Brennan raised an eyebrow. Wade hadn't bought more than tobacco and coffee in 6 months. Everyone knew his ranch was barely hanging on. Everyone knew he worked his land alone and spoke to no one and came to town only when he had to. What kind of supplies? Flour, cornmeal, beans, salt pork. That's a lot of supplies. Wade, it's supplies. She studied him for a long moment. Then she started pulling things from the shelves. Red Star flour, stone-ground cornmeal, navy beans in a cloth sack, salt pork wrapped in butcher paper. 38 cents, she said. Wade counted out the coins from the leather pouch Ellen had made him before the consumption took her. There wasn't much left after, but there was enough. He gathered the supplies into a burlap sack. "Which wagon's hers?" Mrs. Brennan's mouth twitched. Might have been a smile. "The one with the loose board on the left side belongs to Widow Henshaw. Sarah does her washing." She paused. "She's staying in the widow's back room. Walks to my place most mornings looking for day work." Wade nodded. Information given, information received. Mrs. Brennan watched him. "Ranch is 8 miles east on the main road. Can't miss it. Only place out there with a dead garden." Their eyes met. Understanding passed between them. Wade took the sack, walked out. The street was empty in that way late afternoons get, when the heat's been sitting on the land all day, and even the dogs have given up looking for shade. Wade's boots kicked up small clouds of dust. The wagon sat outside the mercantile, one wheel cocked at an angle where the ground dipped. Widow Henshaw's wagon. He could see the loose board, see where it had been patched with wire and hope. Sarah wasn't in sight. Probably around back by the well. Women always went there after something shameful. Cool water. Privacy. A chance to let your face do what it needed to do without witnesses. Wade lifted the sack into the wagon bed. Set it down careful, like it mattered where it landed. Like the placement of flour and beans could somehow say what he couldn't. He looked at it there. The burlap rough and pale against the weathered wood. Then he walked away. Didn't run. Didn't hurry. Just walked back to where he'd tied his horse, mounted up, and rode out of town before anyone could ask questions he didn't know how to answer. Sarah came around the corner of the mercantile with her face washed and her spine straight, and the bread clutched against her chest like a child. She saw the sack. Stopped. Looked left, right. The street was empty except for a paint horse disappearing around the corner 2 blocks down, dust settling in its wake. She set the bread down in the wagon seat and put both hands on the sack. Opened it. Stared. Flour. Cornmeal. Beans. Salt pork. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She looked up again at the empty street, at the dust still hanging in the air where someone had ridden away. Inside the mercantile. Mrs. Brennan stood at the window, the cameo brooch in her palm. Watching. She smiled. Set the brooch in the drawer behind the counter, where Sarah's mother's memory would wait until it could come home. If you're reading this from a place where neighbors still look out for each other, where a small kindness can carry someone through a hard season, it helps to know we're not alone in remembering what matters. 3 days later, Sarah stood in Mrs. Brennan's store with the sack's contents transferred to her own flour tin and the empty burlap folded in her hands. "Who was it?" she asked. Mrs. Brennan was rearranging canned goods on a shelf, didn't turn around, Man who needs help has a ranch 8 miles east on the main road. Only place out there with a garden gone to weeds. A name, Wade Cooper. Sarah's fingers tightened on the burlap. Why would he? Don't know. Didn't ask. Mrs. Brennan turned then, looked at her direct. But a man who does that kind of thing without needing his name attached, that's a particular kind of man. Sarah nodded. Swallowed. The widow's wagon. Do you think she'd already asked her? She says you can take it. Needs it back by supper. The road east was more rut than earth. Sarah drove the borrowed wagon with hands that cramped on the reins. The horse was old, plodded more than walked. The sun climbed and pressed down on her shoulders through the thin fabric of her dress. 8 miles. She'd left before dawn. The widow had packed her a biscuit wrapped in cloth. Sarah had eaten it at mile 3. Her mouth was dry now. Dust coated her tongue. The land flattened out between 2 low rises. A house appeared. Barn. Corral. And there a plot of earth that might have been a garden once. Sarah's breath caught. Dead. All of it. Tomato vines black and twisted on stakes that leaned like drunks. Squash plants dried to husks. Weeds choking what might have been beans. A man worked 40 yards out, replacing a fence post, his back to the road. The sound of the wagon made him straighten. Turn. Sarah pulled the horse to a stop, climbed down. Her legs shook from the drive, but she locked her knees and made them hold. He walked toward her, slow. His hat brim threw shadow across his face. Closer now. She could see dust on his shirt, sweat darkening the fabric between his shoulder blades. 10 feet away, he stopped. Sarah's mouth opened. The words she'd practiced all morning scattered like birds. I know it was you, she said. Came out harder than she meant. The sack. His jaw worked. He looked past her at the wagon. At the road behind, at everything except her face. Needed work, she said, the words tumbling now. Can tend a garden, cook, mend, whatever needs doing. His eyes went to the dead plot. Something crossed his face. Gone before she could name it. Garden's dead, he said. I can see that. He walked past her. She followed. Up close, the plot was worse. Nothing salvageable, just death and neglect and time. Wade's hand lifted, reached toward a tomato vine, stopped an inch away. His fingers curled into his palm, pulled back like the thing had burned him. Sarah saw it. The way his shoulders went rigid, the muscle jumping in his jaw. My mother had a garden, she said, in Ohio. Taught me. He looked at her hands. She didn't hide them. Let him see the dirt under her nails, the calluses, the places where lye soap had cracked the skin. Cottage out back, he said. Voice rough. Meals, $1 a week. She nodded before the words finished. Before he could take them back. I accept. Get your things. This is my things. He looked at the carpet bag in the wagon bed. 1 bag. That was all she had left in the world. Something shifted in his face. He picked up the bag, carried it toward a small structure behind the main house. She followed. The cottage was 1 room. Rope bed. Stove with 1 leg missing. Propped on bricks. Enamelware basin chipped at the rim. Window facing east. Nothing else. He set her bag down on the floor, gentle, like it might break. Start tomorrow, he said. Then he walked out. Sarah stood in the empty room, looked at the window. Through it, she could see the dead garden. Beyond that, Wade's back as he returned to his fence post. She turned to unpack and stopped. There on the floor beside her bag sat a pair of leather work gloves. Good ones, bone buttons at the wrist, the same gloves she'd seen in Mrs. Brennan's window last week for more than she made in a month washing clothes. The beans came up first. Sarah was on her knees in the dirt when she saw the first green shoots pushing through. 3 weeks she'd been at the ranch. 3 weeks of turning soil that fought back like it had forgotten what water was. Her shoulders ached. Her hands had blistered inside the leather gloves. Healed. Blistered again. But the beans were up. She sat back on her heels and wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. Left a streak of mud she didn't care about. Across the yard, Wade was mending fence. Had been for an hour. She'd watched him pull 3 rotted posts, dig new holes, set cedar replacements. He worked steady, methodical. Never looked her direction. Except he did. She'd caught him twice when she stood to stretch. His head would turn just slightly, then back to his work like he'd been checking the horizon and she just happened to be in the way. The squash vines were spreading too. 5 plants, each one sending out runners that grabbed at the earth like they were afraid of being pulled up. She'd planted marigolds between the rows. Her mother had always said marigolds kept the beetles away, whether it was true or not. Sarah didn't know. But the bright orange flowers made the garden look like something instead of just dirt and hope. She pulled a few weeds from around the bean shoots. Felt the sun hot on her neck. Heard the rhythmic thud of Wade's post driver hitting wood. They hadn't spoken in 3 days. On Sunday, Wade hitched the wagon without being asked. Sarah was hanging wash on the line behind the cottage when she heard him. The jangle of harness. The creak of leather. She came around front with her hands still damp, apron spotted with soap. "Going to town," he said. Didn't look at her. "Need seed packets." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "For the herbs," he added. She looked at him then. Really looked. He was checking the harness buckle like it required all his attention. But his jaw was tight, like the words cost him something. "Yes," she said. "Get in." The ride took 40 minutes. They didn't talk. Just the sound of the wagon wheels and the horse's hooves and once, a red-tailed hawk crying somewhere overhead. Town was busier than she'd seen it. Sunday meant church had let out. People clustered in groups outside the mercantile, outside the feed store. Women in their good dresses, men in clean shirts. The talking stopped when Wade's wagon rolled past. Sarah felt eyes on her like hands. She kept her spine straight, looked ahead, but her fingers twisted in her lap until Wade's voice cut through. "Stop that!" She looked at him. His eyes were on the road, his hands loose on the reins. "They can look all they want," he said. Quiet. "Don't mean you got to give them nothing." Sarah's hands stilled. Wade pulled up in front of the mercantile, set the brake, climbed down, came around to her side and held up his hand. She took it. His palm was rough, warm. He let go the second her feet touched ground. Inside. Mrs. Brennan smiled. "Sarah?" "Wade?" "Ma'am," Wade said. Headed for the hardware section, Sarah went to the seed display. Chamomile, feverfew, yarrow. She touched each packet, checked the price marked in pencil on the corner. Her arithmetic was careful, slow. "Living out there now, are you?" Sarah's hand stopped. She didn't turn around. Didn't need to. She knew that voice. Mrs. Pike. The blacksmith's wife. The woman who ran the church ladies' auxiliary and made sure everyone knew it. "Working," Sarah said. Kept her voice level. "Tending his garden." "Of course." "Dear." Mrs. Pike's voice got louder, meant for more ears than Sarah's. "That what they call it now?" Heat crawled up Sarah's neck. She picked up the chamomile packet. "Held it. Living out there," Mrs. Pike continued. "Talking to the other women now. Not Sarah. No chaperone. Unmarried woman. We all know what that means." Sarah's jaw ached from clenching. She picked up the feverfew, the yarrow. Her hands shook as she gathered what she needed. Walked to the counter. Wade was already there, box of nails in one hand. He looked at her face, then passed her at Mrs. Pike. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. Mrs. Brennan wrapped the seeds in brown paper. "Anything else?" "No, ma'am," Sarah said. Wade paid. Took the wrapped seeds from Mrs. Brennan, handed them to Sarah. Their fingers brushed. Brief. Outside. He helped her into the wagon, his hand on her elbow. Steadying. Every eye in town watched. Mrs. Pike stood on the mercantile porch, her mouth a thin line. Disapproval written in every rigid angle of her body. Wade climbed up beside Sarah, released the brake, clicked to the horse. They rode out of town in silence. Back at the ranch, Sarah planted while Wade built. She worked the herb section, pushing each seed into soil, covering it, patting down the earth, her movements careful, precise, the way her mother had taught her, 20 feet away. Wade was constructing a new fence around the garden plot. He'd set the corner posts that morning. Now he was running wire. The work required 2 people. One to hold the post steady, one to loop the wire and pull it tight. But he worked alone. Sarah watched him struggle with a post that wanted to lean, watched him try to hold it and pull wire at the same time. The post shifted. The wire went slack. She stood, walked over, put both hands on the post, steadied it. Wade looked at her. She nodded at the wire. He pulled it tight, looped it around. Their hands were inches apart on the cedar post, both gripping, both holding. The space between their fingers narrow enough to feel the heat of the other's skin. Wade's hand twitched, like he'd thought about moving it closer. Sarah's breath caught. She pulled back, stepped away. The post held steady now. Wade secured the wire, tested it. Solid. "Thank you," he said. Sarah nodded, went back to her planting. They worked through the afternoon. No more words, just the rhythm of 2 people in the same space, moving around each other, aware. When the sun started to drop, Sarah went to her cottage, put coffee on to boil, her blue enamel pot, the one she'd found in the cottage and scrubbed until it shined. She poured 2 cups when it was ready, carried one across the yard to where Wade was cleaning his tools. She held it out. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch this time. He was careful about that. "Coffee's good," he said. 3 days of silence. And now this. Sarah's throat went tight. "It's just coffee." "It's good." She turned to go. "Garden looks real good. Miss Sarah." The words stopped her feet. She looked back. He was watching her. Not the garden. Her. And in his eyes was something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Something that looked like respect. Sarah knelt in the herb section with her hands cupped around a chamomile plant. The flowers were small, white petals around yellow centers that smelled sweet when she brushed them. She'd planted them a week ago in the corner of the garden where the afternoon shade from the barn hit just right. Chamomile didn't like full sun all day. Wade's shadow fell across the dirt beside her. She looked up. He stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. His shirt was dark with sweat down the back. He'd been working the north pasture all morning. "That the chamomile?" he asked. "Yes." He crouched down. Not too close. Left a foot of space between them. His knees cracked when he settled. The sound loud in the quiet. "Mama called it mercy flower," Sarah said. Her fingers touched the leaves, soft, feathery, like something that might blow away if you weren't careful. "Because it eases pain." Wade's hand came out, hesitated in the air above the plant, then touched it. His fingers were thick, scarred across the knuckles from years of fence wire and rough work, but gentle when they brushed the leaves. "Why mercy?" he asked. "People used to think the Lord put certain plants here for certain purposes. Chamomile for headaches, for when you can't sleep, for when things hurt and you need them to stop hurting." She pulled her hand back. Let him touch the plant without her in the way. "Matricaria camomilla," she said. "That's the Latin name. The real name. You know Latin?" "Just plant names. My mother taught me. Her mother taught her, back in Ohio. Our garden had labels on little wooden stakes with both names, English and Latin." He stayed there, crouched beside her, looking at the chamomile like it was something worth studying. The sun beat down on both of them. A bead of sweat ran down Sarah's temple. She wiped it away, left another streak of dirt she couldn't see. "This one's yarrow," she said, pointed to the plant beside the chamomile. Taller. White flower clusters on straight stems that stood up like they had a purpose. "Achillea millefolium. Good for wounds. You make a poultice from the leaves. Press it against cuts. Helps them heal clean." Wade's eyes went to the yarrow. Took it in. His lips moved slightly, like he was practicing the name without sound. "And that's feverfew," Sarah continued. "Third plant in the row. Small white flowers with yellow centers. Similar to chamomile, but the leaves were different. More jagged. Tanacetum parthenium. For fever. For headaches that pound behind your eyes until you can't think straight. Say the chamomile one again." "Matricaria camomilla." He mouthed it, silent, getting the shape of the words, the rhythm. "Matricaria camomilla," he said out loud. The syllables came out clean. Perfect. Like he'd been saying Latin words his whole life instead of just now. Sarah blinked, stared at him. "You have a good ear. Used to read some. Before." The word hung there. Before. Before what? She didn't ask, but it sat between them like smoke. Wade stood. His knees cracked again, louder this time. He looked down at the herb section, at the 3 plants she'd taught him, at the small wooden stakes she'd pushed into the ground beside each one. "You make those?" he asked, nodded at the stakes. "Yes." Each stake had a name carved into it: chamomile, yarrow, feverfew. Her whittling wasn't skilled. The letters were uneven, but readable. "Knife work's clean," Wade said. Sarah looked at her hands, at the small cuts on her fingers from the blade slipping, from learning as she went. "Thank you." He put his hat back on, adjusted the brim against the sun. "Need anything else from town?" "No." "All right then." He walked away, 10 steps toward the barn, stopped, turned back. "Had a wife once," he said. Sarah's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Wade looked at the ground, at the barn wall, at the fence line in the distance, anywhere but at her. "Died," he said. 3 years back. That was all. No details, no explanation. Just those few words dropped like stones into still water. Sarah's throat was tight. She wanted to say something, offer comfort, ask questions. But the set of his shoulders told her not to, told her this was all he could give right now. "I'm sorry," she said. Quiet. Wade nodded once, sharp, then turned and walked to the barn, disappeared inside. Sarah stayed kneeling in the dirt beside the chamomile, her hand still resting on the leaves, the mercy flower, the one that eased pain. She wondered what kind of pain Wade carried, what kind of wife he'd lost, what kind of man he'd been before grief hollowed him out and left him working alone on a dying ranch with a garden he couldn't bear to touch. That afternoon, Wade climbed onto the cottage roof with a hammer and a box of shingles. Sarah was inside hanging chamomile to dry when she heard him up there. The thud of boots on wood, the scrape of something being dragged across the roof's surface. She stepped outside, looked up. He was crouched near the peak, pulling off a shingle that had cracked down the middle, split clean through from weather and time. He tossed it over the side. It landed in the dust with a slap. "Roof's got 3 bad spots," he called down. Still didn't look at her, just kept working, pulling nails, removing damaged wood. "Fix them before the rains come." Sarah picked up the broken shingle, ran her thumb along the crack. The wood was old, brittle, ready to fail. "When do the rains come?" "October, maybe November, depends on the year." She set the shingle aside, watched him work. He moved like a man who'd done this before. Many times, no wasted motion. Pull the nails with the claw hammer. Remove the bad shingle. Slide the new one into place. Nail it down. 3 hits per nail, each one solid and sure. The sun was past noon. Hot. His shirt stuck to his back between the shoulder blades. Sarah went inside. Came back with her tin cup filled with water from the pump. Set it on the porch step where he could reach it when he came down. Then she went back to her chamomile, tying the stems with twine, hanging them upside down from the rope she'd strung across her cottage ceiling. The flowers would dry there, curl into themselves, turn brown, but keep their properties, keep their ability to ease pain and bring sleep to those who needed it. The hammering continued outside, steady, rhythmic, the sound of a man fixing what was broken because that was what you did. You fixed what you could, and you lived with what you couldn't. Evening came with long shadows. Sarah made coffee in her blue enamel pot, strong, the way he seemed to like it. She poured 2 cups, her tin cup with no handle wrapped in cloth so she could hold it, and a proper cup for him. She carried both across the yard. Wade sat in his usual chair on the porch, the other chair empty beside him like it had been waiting. She climbed the 2 steps, held out his cup. He took it. "Thank you." She stood there, the empty chair between them. An invitation unspoken. "Could sit," he said, "if you want." Sarah sat. They drank coffee and watched the sun go down. Orange light spread across the land like something spilled, made the dust look gold, made the prairie grass almost beautiful instead of just dry and waiting for rain that might not come. A coyote called from somewhere north, long and lonesome, the sound carrying across the empty miles. "They'll be out soon," Wade said. "I like the sound," Sarah said. He glanced at her. Quick. Then back at the sunset, his cup halfway to his mouth, steam rising. "Your mother," he said. "She teach you all those plants. Yes, we had a garden in Ohio. Big one. She knew every plant by name, English and Latin both. Used to make medicines for people in town. Teas, poultices, tinctures. She's still there. Ohio. She died 5 years ago. Consumption took her like it takes so many." Wade nodded, took a sip of coffee. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just quiet. The kind where words weren't necessary because the coffee was hot and the chairs were solid and the day was ending the way days should end. "That why you came west?" he asked. "Partly." Sarah's hand tightened on her cup. The cloth wrapping slipped. She adjusted it. "My father remarried. Quick, his new wife didn't want me there. Said I was too old to still be living at home, that I needed my own life." "So you came for that banker's son?" It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded anyway. "James, yes." "What happened?" The words stuck in her throat. She had to force them out. "He found someone else, someone whose father owned land instead of working other people's farms, someone who fit better into his future." Wade was quiet for a long time. So long Sarah thought he wouldn't respond. Then his voice came. Low, rough with something that might have been anger, except it was on her behalf. "His loss," he said. Sarah looked at him. Really looked. He was staring at the sunset, his jaw tight, the muscle jumping in his cheek, his knuckles white where he gripped his coffee cup. He meant it. "Thank you," she said. The words barely audible. He nodded, drank his coffee. The sun dropped below the horizon, left the sky streaked with red and purple. The coyote called again. Another answered from somewhere east. When the cups were empty, Wade stood, took hers along with his. "I'll wash these. You don't need to. Go on. Get some rest." Sarah stood, walked back to her cottage. At the door she turned. He was still on the porch, both cups in his hands, watching her. She raised her hand. Small wave. He nodded. Inside, the chamomile hung from the ceiling. The cottage smelled sweet, like summer, like mercy. Sarah lay down on her rope bed and stared at the dried flowers overhead, and thought about a man who'd lost his wife and learned Latin plant names and said his loss like he'd fight anyone who disagreed. Sunday morning came with church bells. Sarah heard them from her cottage, 3 miles away, but the wind carried sound on the prairie. She stood at her window and looked at the dress laid across her rope bed. Calico. High collar with buttons up the front. The nicest thing she owned, even though the hem had been let down twice and the fabric was thin at the elbows. She hadn't been to church since that day in the Mercantile. 5 weeks now. But Mrs. Brennan had stopped by yesterday with eggs and a quiet request. Pastor Miller asked after you, she'd said. Wondered if you were well. I told him you were. But he'd like to see you Sunday, just so folks know you're still part of the community. Sarah had nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. Show your face. Prove you're respectable. Give them nothing to whisper about. She dressed slow, pinned her mother's cameo at her throat, the brooch Mrs. Brennan had kept safe, returned to her 2 weeks ago, wrapped in the same brown paper. Outside, Wade was hitching his horse. Not the wagon. Just the single mount he rode when he needed to check fence lines or move cattle. He wore the same clothes he always wore. Work shirt, worn trousers, nothing special for Sunday. He saw her in her good dress and stopped, his hands stilled on the saddle cinch. "Going to church?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. Finished tightening the cinch, swung up into the saddle. "I'll be in town, if you need." It wasn't an offer, just a statement. He clicked to his horse and rode out before she could respond. Sarah watched him go, then started walking. The walk took an hour and 40 minutes. The church sat on the corner of Main and First, white clapboard that needed paint, tall steeple with a bell that rang every Sunday calling people in. The doors stood open. People clustered on the steps in their Sunday clothes, women in dresses with full sleeves, men in clean shirts with their collars buttoned despite the heat. The talking died when Sarah approached. She kept her head up, her spine straight, climbed the steps. Mrs. Pike stood in the doorway with Mrs. Howard and Mrs. McKinley. 3 women in a line, blocking the entrance without seeming to block it. Mrs. Pike's eyes went to Sarah's dress, to the cameo brooch, to her face. "Sarah, how good of you to join us." The words were polite. The tone was not. "Ma'am," Sarah said, moved to step past. Mrs. Pike shifted, just slightly, enough to make Sarah have to turn sideways to get through. "I'm surprised to see you. Thought you'd be too busy out at Wade Cooper's place. Tending his garden and all." The women behind Mrs. Pike made small sounds, not quite laughter, something meaner. Sarah's hands fisted at her sides. She forced them open. Flat. "Excuse me." She pushed past into the church. The pews were filling up. Families. Couples. Old Mrs. Brennan sat in the 3rd row. Saw Sarah. Smiled. Patted the space beside her. Sarah walked down the aisle. Felt every eye follow her. Heard the whispers start before she even sat down. Living out there. No chaperone. Shameful. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, stared at the cross above the pulpit, wooden, simple. The pastor's Bible sat open on the lectern, pages thin from use. Behind her, Mrs. Pike's voice carried, not quite a whisper, meant to be heard. Of course she'd show her face eventually. Probably needs something from town, money most like. Or maybe Cooper's tired of her and she's looking for the next, "Shall we begin?" Pastor Miller stood at the pulpit. His voice cut through the whispers. Clean. Clear. He looked out over the congregation. His eyes stopped on Mrs. Pike. Held there, long enough to make a point. "Let us stand for the opening hymn." Everyone stood. Sarah stood. The organ wheezed to life. Ancient thing. Out of tune. But loud enough to cover the whispers, they sang. Sarah's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her throat was too tight, her chest too full of something that wasn't air. The hymn ended. They sat. Pastor Miller opened his Bible. "Today we read from Matthew," he said. "Judge not, that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged." Sarah heard Mrs. Pike shift behind her, heard the rustle of fabric, the small sound of disapproval. The service lasted an hour, every minute of it. Sarah felt eyes burning into her back, felt the weight of judgment pressing down. The pastor talked about mercy, about kindness, about the narrow path and how easy it was to stumble. How the righteous were called to help those who had fallen, not to condemn them. Sarah gripped her hymnal so tight her knuckles went white. When the final hymn ended, she was the first one out the door, didn't wait for the receiving line, didn't shake the pastor's hand, just walked. Fast, down the steps, toward the edge of town. "Sarah," Mrs. Pike's voice, loud, deliberately loud. Sarah stopped, every part of her screaming to keep walking, but she turned. Mrs. Pike stood on the top step with her audience around her, women who hung on her every word, who needed someone to judge so they could feel better about their own lives. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Mrs. Pike said, voice carrying across the churchyard. "About your living situation." People had stopped leaving, turned to watch. "It's not proper," Mrs. Pike continued. "A young unmarried woman living alone with a man, no chaperone, no oversight. It sets a bad example. People talk." Sarah's throat burned. "I work for room and board. That's all." "Of course, dear." Mrs. Pike's smile was sharp, cold. "That's what you tell people. But we all know the truth, don't we? A girl who came here for a wedding that didn't happen? A girl with nowhere else to go? A man living alone who suddenly needs someone to tend his garden?" She paused. Let the words sink in. Garden work, is that what they call it now? Heat crawled up Sarah's neck, into her face. Burning there. She felt it. Knew everyone could see it. The women beside Mrs. Pike nodded, their faces pleased, satisfied. "You should think about your reputation," Mrs. Pike said. "What's left of it, anyway? Find more suitable employment. In town, perhaps, where people can see you're conducting yourself properly." Sarah's hands shook. She pressed them against her skirt, tried to make them still, failed. "I have work. Honest work." "Honest?" Mrs. Pike's laugh was sharp, like breaking glass. "My dear girl, there's nothing honest about what you're doing, living in sin under the guise of employment." The words hit like stones. Sarah felt each one land, felt something inside her start to crack. She turned, walked away, fast. Before the tears could come, before anyone could see her break behind her. Mrs. Pike called out something else. Sarah didn't hear it, didn't want to hear it, just walked, away from the church, away from the righteous faces, away from the whispers that followed her like smoke. She made it 2 blocks. Then she saw the wagon. Wade sat in it, right there on the corner of Main and 2nd, the reins loose in his hands, his horse standing patient. He'd been there the whole time, waiting. Sarah stopped, stared. His face was stone, his jaw set, his knuckles white where they gripped the reins. He'd heard everything. He looked at her, tipped his head toward the wagon seat beside him. Sarah climbed up, sat, her legs shaking so hard she could barely manage the step. She didn't speak, couldn't speak. Her throat was closed, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall where people could see. Wade clicked to the horse. The wagon rolled forward. They rode out of town in silence, past the mercantile, past the feed store, past the last houses where the town gave way to prairie. Sarah's hands were fisted in her lap, nails digging into her palms hard enough to hurt, hard enough to feel something besides shame. Beside her, Wade's jaw was tight, his eyes on the road, but his knuckles stayed white on the reins, like he was holding on to something, or holding himself back from something. They didn't speak until the ranch appeared on the horizon. Then Sarah's breath caught, once, twice. The tears came whether she wanted them or not, hot, fast, running down her face and dripping off her jaw. She pressed her hand over her mouth, tried to stop the sound that wanted to come out. Wade pulled the wagon to a stop in front of her cottage. "Set the brake." Sarah climbed down, stumbled. Wade's hand caught her elbow, steadied her, then let go. She walked to her cottage door, opened it, went inside, closed it behind her, leaned against it, slid down until she was sitting on the floor with her back pressed to the wood. Then she cried, great gasping sobs that hurt her chest, tears that wouldn't stop no matter how hard she tried. She pulled her knees up, pressed her forehead against them. Let it all come, garden work. Is that what they call it now? Living in sin. Shameful. The words played over and over, each one cutting deeper. A knock on the door made her jump. She wiped her face. Her hands came away wet, muddy from the dust on them mixing with tears. "Yes." "Coffee's on." Wade's voice through the door. Rough, uncertain. "Made it myself. Tastes like mud, but it's hot." Sarah's breath caught, half laugh, half sob. She stood, opened the door. Wade stood there with 2 cups, steam rising from both, his face awkward, like he didn't know what to do with her tears, what to do with this. "You don't have to," she started. "Just coffee," he said, held out 1 cup. She took it. The tin was hot. She used both hands to hold it, her fingers still shaking. They stood there, her in the doorway, him on the step, the afternoon sun slanting across the yard between them. Sarah sipped the coffee. It was terrible. Burnt. Strong enough to peel paint. But hot, and he'd made it and brought it to her door. "Worse than I thought possible," she said. Her voice came out rough, used up. Wade's mouth twitched. Might have been the start of a smile. "Didn't know that was possible?" Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Not much, just enough to breathe. They stood there drinking terrible coffee while the shadows grew longer, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried. Wade looked at his cup, at the coffee, at anything but her face. "They're wrong," he said. Sarah's throat went tight again. "What they said, they're wrong. But they think, don't matter what they think." His eyes lifted. Met hers. "Hard. Sure. You work hard. You're decent. You don't owe them nothing." The tears wanted to come again. Sarah blinked them back. Wade's hand tightened on his cup. "I'll be here. Long as you need. They want to talk. They can talk. Won't change nothing." Sarah nodded. Couldn't speak, past the tightness in her throat. They finished their coffee in silence, when her cup was empty. Wade took it. His fingers brushed hers. Brief, warm. "Get some rest," he said. He walked back to his house carrying both cups. and Sarah stood in her doorway watching him go, and something in her chest that had felt broken started to knit itself back together. The preacher's horse was lathered when he rode up to the ranch. Sarah was pulling weeds from around the squash vines when she heard the hoofbeats. Fast. Too fast for a casual visit. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron. Wade came out of the barn. The preacher reined his horse to a stop. Dust billowed around them both. "Fever," the preacher said. His face was gray, drawn, like he hadn't slept. East settlements, started 2 weeks back, got the McKinley children sick, the Howards, Widow Henshaw's girl died 3 days ago. Sarah's hands went still on her apron. The widow who'd lent her the wagon, the widow who'd given her work washing clothes, her daughter. Dead. "Doctor?" Wade asked. "Omaha. 2 days' ride. I sent word, but—" The preacher shook his head. Sweat ran down his temples despite the cool morning. "We need help now." Sarah was already moving toward her cottage. Behind her. Wade's voice. "Sarah." She didn't stop. Pushed through her door. Started pulling things from the shelf. The brown bottles, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. Clean cloth torn from an old sheet weeks ago and saved for this. For when someone would need it. Wade appeared in the doorway. Blocked the light. "You don't owe them nothing." Sarah's hands kept moving. Chamomile for pain. Feverfew for fever. Willow bark she'd stripped from branches by the creek and dried in bundles. Her fingers worked fast. Efficient. Packing everything into her carpet bag. "I know," she said. "After what they said, I know." She looked at him, her hands still, the bag half full. "I'm going anyway." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Then nodded once, sharp. "I'll hitch the wagon." The first house belonged to the McKinleys. 3 children. All sick. The youngest was 4. She lay on a pallet by the fireplace with her skin burning and her eyes half closed, glazed. Not seeing. Mrs. McKinley stood in the corner, her hands twisted together, white-knuckled. "The pastor said to keep them cool, but the fever won't break. It won't—" "Willow bark," Sarah said. Set her bag on the table. Opened it. The smell of dried herbs filled the room. "For the fever, and feverfew. Do you have clean water boiling?" "Yes, on the stove." Sarah pulled out the willow bark, broke it into pieces with her hands. The wood was brittle, snapped clean. She dropped the pieces into the pot of boiling water on the stove. The bitter smell rose immediately, sharp, made her eyes water. "This needs to steep," she said. "Then cool it enough they can drink it. Give each child a cup, every 4 hours. Don't skip a dose, even if they fight it." Mrs. McKinley nodded, her hands still shaking. Sarah knelt by the youngest child, put her hand on the girl's forehead. The heat was fierce, like touching metal left in the sun. The child's breath came fast, shallow, her chest heaving with each pull of air. "Cool compresses," Sarah said, pulled clean cloths from her bag, handed them to Mrs. McKinley. "Changed every hour. Keep them on the forehead and neck. Wring them out in cool water. Not cold. Cool. Cold will shock the body. Cool will ease it. Will she—" Mrs. McKinley's voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Will she live?" Sarah looked at the child, at the way her small body trembled, at the sweat soaking her nightdress, at the fever burning through her like fire. "I don't know," Sarah said. Truth, hard. But we'll try everything. Outside. Wade waited by the wagon. Sarah came down the steps, her dress already damp with sweat from the heat of the fireplace, from kneeling beside a dying child. Herb stains marked her hands where the feverfew had bled through the cloth when she'd crushed it. Wade held out his canteen without a word. She took it, drank. The water was warm but wet. She handed it back, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. 2 more houses, the Howards, and Mrs. Pike? Wade's jaw tightened at the last name. But he just nodded, climbed into the wagon, offered his hand to help her up. The Howard house was worse. 4 children, all burning. The mother was sick too, lying on the bed with her husband trying to get water down her throat. Most of it ran down her chin, soaked the pillow. Sarah worked fast. No wasted motion. Willow bark tea. Feverfew tincture. 3 drops under each tongue. The children fought her, turned their heads, cried. But she held firm, got the medicine in. Showed Mr. Howard how to make the compresses, where to place them, how often to change them. Every hour, she said. Don't let them dry out, and the tea. Every 4 hours, even through the night. He nodded, but his eyes were lost, scared, like he didn't believe any of this would work. Sarah touched his shoulder. Brief. Keep them cool. Keep them drinking. That's all you can do. Outside, the sun was past noon. Sarah's back ached from bending, her hands cramped from wringing out cloths, mixing tinctures, breaking willow bark into pieces small enough to steep fast. But there was one more house. Mrs. Pike answered the door. Her face was different than it had been at church. The smugness was gone. The righteousness. Replaced by something raw. Something that looked like terror, barely held in check. "My Tommy," she said, voice breaking. "He's—" Sarah stepped past her, into the house, didn't wait for permission. The boy lay on the sofa, 8 years old, his face flushed red. Sweat soaked his hair flat against his skull. He was muttering, words that made no sense. Fever talk. The kind that meant the mind was burning along with the body. Sarah knelt beside him, put her hand on his forehead. The heat seared her palm. Hotter than the McKinley girl. Hotter than any of the Howard children. "When did it start?" she asked. 2 days ago. Mrs. Pike's voice shook, thin, stripped of all its usual certainty. "He was fine at breakfast. Then by noon he couldn't stand." Sarah opened her bag, pulled out the willow bark, the feverfew, the clean cloths. Her supplies were running low. This was the last house. After this, there would be nothing left. "I need boiling water," she said. Mrs. Pike nodded, rushed to the stove, put the kettle on. Her hands trembled so hard the kettle rattled against the iron. Sarah broke willow bark into a cup when the water boiled. Mrs. Pike poured it over. Steam rose. The bitter smell filled the room. Sarah let it steep, counted seconds in her head. 1 minute, 2, 3. Then she lifted Tommy's head, put the cup to his lips. "Drink. I know it's bitter, but drink." The boy's throat worked. Most of the tea spilled down his chin, but some went down. She could see his throat move, swallowing, taking it in. She laid him back, wrung out a cloth in the basin of cool water Mrs. Pike had ready, placed it on his forehead. Then his neck, then his wrists where the pulse beat fast and frantic. "Change these every hour," Sarah said. Didn't look at Mrs. Pike. Kept her eyes on Tommy, on his breathing, on the way his chest rose and fell too fast. "The tea. Give him more in 4 hours. As much as he'll take." Mrs. Pike stood there, her hands at her sides. Fisted. Then she sank to her knees beside Sarah, not praying, just collapsing, like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "I was wrong," she whispered. Tears ran down her face. "What I said, at church, he needs you focused," Sarah said. Cut her off. Didn't want to hear it. Not now, not when a child was dying and there was still work to do. "The fever might break tonight. It might not. But you need to keep him cool and get this tea into him. You understand?" "Yes." Sarah stood, picked up her empty bag. All her supplies gone, distributed among 3 houses, 3 families, children who might live or might die, and she wouldn't know which until it was over. She walked to the door. Mrs. Pike's voice stopped her. "Thank you." Sarah looked back. Mrs. Pike was still on her knees beside her son, her face wet, her hands shaking as she wrung out another cloth. Sarah nodded, stepped outside. Wade was waiting. He'd pulled the wagon to the side of the house, out of sight of the street. The horses stood with their heads down. Tired. Sarah climbed up, sat, felt every muscle in her body ache. Her hands were stained dark green from the herbs. The smell of feverfew clung to her dress. Her hair, her skin. "More houses?" Wade asked. "No." Her voice came out hoarse. "Used up. Just those 3. He clicked to the horses. They started forward. Slow. "We should stay," Sarah said. "In town, in case someone needs me tonight." Wade nodded. Drove to the church. Tied the horses to the rail outside. The church door was unlocked. They went inside. Sat on the front pew. The wood was hard, unforgiving, but solid. The late afternoon light came through the windows, made patterns on the floor. Dust drifted in the beams, slow, lazy, like the world outside wasn't burning with fever, like children weren't fighting for breath in houses across town. Sarah leaned back, closed her eyes, felt the exhaustion pull at her, drag her down, beside her. Wade was silent, just there, a warm, solid presence in the empty church. Hours passed. The light faded. Someone lit lamps in the houses around them. Small yellow glows in the darkness. Sarah dozed, her head dropping forward, jerking up, dropping again. Near midnight. The church door opened. Mr. Howard stood there. "The fever broke. My wife, the children, all of them." Sarah's breath caught. "All of them. All of them." The youngest woke up asking for water, real water, not fever thirst, real thirst. She nodded, felt something loosen in her chest. Mr. Howard left. More hours. Dawn came gray and cool, different from evening, thinner, more fragile. Mrs. McKinley appeared in the doorway. "3 are better, much better. The fever's gone." She paused, her face uncertain. "But the youngest, she's still burning." Sarah stood. Every joint protested. Stiff from sitting all night. She walked to the door. Wade followed. They went to the McKinley house. The youngest child lay on her pallet, still, too still. Sarah's heart dropped. Then the girl's eyes opened. Clear, focused. The fever flush was weeks. "Mama," she said, voice weak but there. Mrs. McKinley sobbed, gathered her daughter into her arms. Sarah backed away, out of the house, into the street. The morning sun was climbing, warm on her face. Wade was there, always there. "She's better," Sarah said. Her voice sounded strange, distant. "They're all better, except she needed to check on Tommy, needed to see if Mrs. Pike's son had made it through the night. Her legs felt like water. She made them move anyway. 1 step, 2, toward Mrs. Pike's house 3 blocks away. The world tilted, sideways, then up, then down. Sarah's knees gave out. She felt herself falling. Saw the ground coming up to meet her. Too fast, too hard. Then Wade's arms were there, catching her, holding her up, his voice close to her ear. Rough. Urgent. "I got you." Everything went black. Wade carried her to the cottage. Sarah felt his arms under her knees, behind her shoulders, felt the ground disappear beneath her. Her head rolled against his chest, the fabric of his shirt rough against her cheek, smelling of horse and sweat and something that was just him. She tried to speak. Her mouth wouldn't form words, her tongue thick, heavy. "I got you," he said, low, close to her ear. The cottage door, the dim interior. He laid her on the rope bed. The mattress creaked under her weight. She felt him pull off her boots, one, then the other, heard them hit the floor with dull thuds. A blanket came up over her, rough wool against her chin, the weight of it pressing down. "Sleep," Wade said. Sarah's eyes closed. She couldn't have kept them open if her life depended on it. She woke to the smell of something burning. Her eyes opened. Struggled to focus. The light was different, late afternoon. She'd slept through the day. Lost hours she couldn't account for. Wade sat in the chair by her bed, a bowl in his hands, steam rising from it. His face tight with concentration, like he was holding something that might break. "Made soup," he said when he saw her eyes open. It's food." Sarah tried to sit up. Her arms shook, gave out before she'd moved more than an inch. She fell back against the pillow. The effort left her breathless. Wade set the bowl down, moved to help her, his hands behind her shoulders, lifting, gentle, like she was made of something fragile. He propped her against the wall, picked up the bowl again. "Can you hold it?" he asked. Sarah's hands trembled when she lifted them, like they belonged to someone else, someone old, used up. Wade set the bowl in her palms, kept his hands under it. Steadying, taking most of the weight, she sipped. The soup was thin, burnt at the bottom where it had stuck to the pot, barely warm, but wet. She swallowed. It went down, her throat working around it. "More," Wade said. She sipped again, and again. Half the bowl before her stomach clenched, rebelled. She shook her head. Wade took the bowl, set it aside on the floor. "You need to rest more." "How long was I?" 2 days. Sarah blinked. 2 days. She looked down at herself. Someone had changed her dress, put her in her nightgown, the white cotton one with buttons up the front. Heat crawled up her neck, into her face, burning there. "Mrs. Brennan came," Wade said. reading her face like he could see the shame written there. Changed your clothes? Sat with you yesterday while I tended the stock. I stayed outside. Sarah nodded, the heat still burning in her cheeks. She'd been helpless, unconscious, had to be undressed like a child, tended to like an invalid. I'll let you sleep, Wade said, started to stand. Wait! He stopped, sat back down, his hands on his knees, waiting. Thank you, Sarah said. The words cost her, made her throat tight. For the soup, for... She gestured vaguely at the room, at herself, at everything she couldn't name. Yeah. He stood, walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. I'll bring more later. Try to sleep. He left. The door closed, soft behind him. Sarah lay back, stared at the ceiling where the dried herbs hung. Her body ached. Every muscle felt bruised, used up. But worse than the physical pain was the shame. The knowledge that she'd failed, collapsed. Had to be carried like dead weight. Had to be cared for when she was supposed to be the one doing the caring. She closed her eyes, slept. Night came. Sarah woke to lamplight. Wade sat in the chair again, a book in his hands. His lips moved as he read, silent, forming words she couldn't hear. What are you reading? Her voice came out rough, dry like sand. Wade's eyes lifted from the page. Didn't mean to wake you. What is it? He held up the book, battered, spine cracked, pages loose at the binding, some of them folded at the corners. Whitman, Leaves of Grass, Ellen's book. She liked poetry. Read it out loud. Wade's face shifted, uncertain. I don't read fancy. Please. He looked at the book, at her, back at the book, cleared his throat, started to read. I celebrate myself and sing myself. His voice low, hesitant, testing each word. And what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Sarah closed her eyes. Let the words wash over her. Wade's voice grew steadier as he read, less hesitant. The lamplight made shadows on the wall, moved when he turned pages. I loaf and invite my soul, he read. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. The words painted pictures. Green grass, open sky, freedom that felt like a memory of something she'd never had. Wade's voice continued. Steady. Sure. Like he'd been reading poetry his whole life, instead of just stumbling through it in a dim cottage, while a woman who wasn't his wife lay in bed listening. Sarah's eyes grew heavy, fought to stay open, wanted to hear more. But her body had other ideas. She slept, dreaming. Sarah was back in Ohio, in her mother's garden. But the plants were wrong, dead, black like they'd been burned. Her mother stood among them with dirt on her hands and that look on her face, the one that said disappointment without having to speak it. You killed them, her mother said. No, I tried. Not enough. You're never enough. The garden shifted, became the mercantile in Nebraska, but bigger, full of people, all of them staring, all of them whispering. James was there, tall, handsome, the way he'd looked in the photograph he'd sent. but his eyes were cold, empty, looking at her like she was something that had fooled him, something that had pretended to be valuable and turned out to be worthless. "The garden wasn't enough," he said, his voice carrying across the mercantile, making sure everyone heard. "You weren't enough. Sarah Merrick, plain, poor, insufficient." The word hit like a fist. Insufficient. Mrs. Pike stepped forward, her face pleased, satisfied. We all knew, didn't we, a woman like that, thinking she could be anything more than what she is. The crowd nodded, murmured agreement. Sarah tried to speak, to defend herself, but her mouth wouldn't work. The words stuck in her throat, choking her. James turned away. "I found someone better. Someone whose father owns land. Someone who fits. Someone enough." Someone enough. Sarah was falling. The floor dropping away beneath her feet. No ground, just empty air, and James's voice following her down. "Not enough, not enough, not enough." She hit ground. But it wasn't ground. It was mud, black, thick. It covered her hands when she tried to push herself up. Her arms rose to her waist. She tried to climb out. The mud pulled her down, sucked at her, into her mouth, her nose, choking her. Not enough. "Sarah." A hand on hers. Warm. Real. "Sarah, wake up." Her eyes opened. The cottage, lamplight, Wade leaning over her with his hand covering hers on the blanket, his face close, concerned. "You were talking," he said. "Sounded like a bad dream." Sarah's face was wet. Tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. The shame of it burned, adding to the shame from the dream, from the collapse, from everything. "James," she said. The word tasted like the mud from her dream. Black, choking. "He said I wasn't enough. The garden wasn't enough. I wasn't." Her voice broke. "He was right. I'm not." Wade's hand tightened on hers. "Stop. But he was right. He was a fool." The words came out hard, final, like an axe through wood, like something that couldn't be argued with or questioned. Sarah stared at him. His face was close, lit from the side by the lamp, his eyes dark, intent. Something in them she'd never seen directed at her before, something fierce. "You hear me?" Wade said, his voice rough, low. "He was a fool. You're enough. You're more than enough." Sarah's throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Tears came harder now. Not from the dream, from something else, something too big to name. Wade's thumb brushed across her knuckles. Once, gentle. Then he pulled his hand back, sat back in the chair, put distance between them. "Sleep," he said. "I'll be right here." Sarah's eyes burned. New tears came. She turned her face to the wall so he wouldn't see, but her shoulders shook, gave her away. She slept. Morning came with bird song. Sarah woke alone, the chair empty, the lamp out, gray light through the window. She sat up, slow, testing. Her head swam but held. Her arms shook but held. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, put her feet on the floor, stood. The room tilted. She grabbed the bedpost, waited for it to steady. It did. She walked to the window, looked out. Wade was at the corral, working with one of the horses, his movements slow, patient. The horse tossed its head. Wade's hand came up, touched its neck. The horse settled. Sarah watched him, remembered his hand on hers. The way he'd said, "You're enough," like it was fact, like there was no question, like James and Mrs. Pike and everyone who'd ever judged her didn't know what they were talking about. Her chest felt tight, but not in a bad way, in a way that made her want to cry and laugh at the same time. She turned from the window, saw something on the floor by the door, a tin can, old, label worn off. Inside, wildflowers, Indian paintbrush with their red blooms, black-eyed Susan's bright yellow, purple stems she still didn't know the name for, already wilting. Petals starting to curl at the edges. Sarah picked up the can, carried it to the windowsill, set it where the light hit it. She touched one of the black-eyed Susans. The petals were soft, delicate, dying already. But he'd picked them, cut them, put them in a can, left them where she'd find them. She looked out the window again. Wade was still working with the horse, his back to the cottage, like he didn't want to be seen, like the flowers were a secret he'd left and walked away from. Sarah stood there with her hand on the tin can and watched him work and tried to remember the last time someone had given her flowers. Couldn't. James had never given her flowers, had never said she was enough, had never sat by her bedside reading poetry while she slept, or brought her terrible soup he'd made himself, or left wildflowers in a tin can. James had sent a letter, 2 pages, clean handwriting, explaining why she wasn't suitable, why he'd found someone better, why she should understand and not make a fuss. She'd burned that letter the day it came. But the words had stayed, lived in her head, played on repeat until she believed them. Not enough. Insufficient. Sarah's hand tightened on the tin can. Outside, Wade turned, saw her in the window, raised his hand. Small wave. She waved back. He held her eyes for a moment, then turned back to the horse. Sarah set the can down, went to her trunk, found a clean dress, started to change. Her hands shook on the buttons, not from weakness this time, from something else. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and not knowing if what came next was falling or flying. Sunday morning came with the sound of wagons. Sarah was at the stove making coffee when she heard them. Multiple wagons. The rattle of wood on hard ground, the jangle of harness, voices carrying across the prairie. She went to the window, looked out. 5 wagons, maybe 6. Coming up the road toward the ranch. People filled them, men, women, children in the wagon beds, the backs loaded with something. Lumber, tools, bundles wrapped in cloth. Sarah's breath caught. Wade came out of the barn, stopped, stared at the approaching wagons. His body went rigid. His hand moved, reached behind him into the barn where he kept his rifle propped against the wall. Sarah was out the cottage door before she thought about it, running across the yard. "Wade, wait!" He looked at her, his hand on the rifle stock, his jaw set, eyes hard. "Look," she said, pointed at the wagons. "They're carrying lumber, tools, not guns." Wade's jaw worked. He looked at the wagons, at the people. His hand stayed on the rifle, knuckles white. The first wagon pulled to a stop 20 feet from the barn. Mr. Howard climbed down, raised both hands, palms out, showing they were empty. "We came to build," he said. "If you'll let us." Wade's hand tightened on the rifle. "Build what?" "A still room. For Sarah." She needs a proper place to work, to store her medicines, to help people when they're sick. Mr. Howard gestured to the wagons behind him. We brought lumber, tools, food, whatever it takes. Wade looked at Sarah. She nodded. Slow. His hand left the rifle. Came back empty. Fisted at his side. The wagons rolled forward, stopped in a line near the cottage. People climbed down. Men started unloading lumber. Women carried baskets covered with checked cloths. Children ran between the wagons playing. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, not knowing what to do, where to stand, what to say. Her hands twisted in her apron until the fabric bunched. Mrs. Brennan appeared at her elbow. Where do you want the shelves? Sarah's mouth opened. Nothing came out. For your herbs, Mrs. Brennan said, patient. Your medicines. You'll need shelves to keep them organized. Sarah swallowed. Found her voice. 3 shelves. Maybe 4. On the north wall, where the light won't be too strong. Too much sun spoils the herbs. Mrs. Brennan nodded, walked to where the men were working. Said something to the blacksmith. He nodded. Started measuring boards. The sound of hammers filled the air, saws cutting through wood, men calling to each other. Hand me that board. Hold this steady. Careful with your fingers there. The framework went up first. Posts at the corners driven into the ground, beams across the top connecting them. The men worked in pairs, one holding, one nailing. 3 hits per nail. Solid, sure. The sound rhythmic like a heartbeat. Sarah watched Wade. He stood at a distance, not helping, not leaving, just watching, his face unreadable. His arms crossed over his chest. The widow Henshaw brought him water in a tin cup. He took it, nodded, drank, handed it back. The widow's daughter was dead, had been dead for days now. But the widow smiled at him, sad but real, then moved away. By noon, the walls were up, pine boards nailed vertical, still smelling of sap. Fresh cut. The men stopped for food. The women had laid out everything on tables made from sawhorses and planks. Fried chicken, biscuits split and filled with butter, preserves in glass jars, smoked ham sliced thin, pie with lattice crust. Sarah's hands shook when she picked up a plate. Mrs. McKinley put a biscuit on it, added a piece of chicken. Eat, you're still recovering. Sarah bit into the biscuit. It was good. Buttery, flaky. She couldn't taste it. Couldn't feel anything except the tightness in her throat that wouldn't let go no matter how hard she swallowed. Wade appeared beside her. Didn't take food. Just stood there. Close enough that his shoulder almost touched hers, but didn't quite. That small, not quite touch steadied something inside her. Made the shaking in her hands ease. Afternoon brought the roof. Shingles laid in rows, overlapping so rain would run off instead of seeping through. The men worked from ladders, passed shingles up, nailed them down. The sound steady, constant. Sarah stood in the doorway of the new still room. It smelled of fresh cut pine, of sawdust, of promise. The blacksmith and his sons were building shelves along the north wall, measuring with a folding ruler, cutting boards to exact lengths, fitting them together with joints that would hold without nails. A window on the east side, small, 4 panes of glass that caught the afternoon light. For morning sun, for seeing clearly when mixing medicines. A table in the center, rough-hewn but sturdy, for laying out herbs, for preparing tinctures, for the work she'd do here. A proper still room. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth, felt tears burn behind her eyes. Not sad tears. Something else. Something that hurt worse, because it was good. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Mrs. Pike stood there. Tommy beside her. The boy looked healthy. Color in his cheeks. Steady on his feet. Eyes clear. Alive. Sarah's hand dropped from her mouth. Mrs. Pike's face was different than Sarah had ever seen it. The smugness was gone. The certainty. The righteous judgment, replaced by something raw, exposed, like a wound that had been covered too long and finally opened to air. "I need to say something," Mrs. Pike said. Her voice shook. Thin, stripped. What I said. At church. Before. It was wrong. Sarah waited. Didn't speak. Let the silence stretch. "I was cruel." Mrs. Pike's hands twisted together, white-knuckled, like she was wringing out invisible cloths. "I was cruel because I was scared. Scared of what people would think if I didn't say something, if I didn't keep the rules everybody expects." She looked at Tommy, at her son, who'd been dying, who was breathing. "But you saved him. After I'd said those things. After I'd been—" Her voice broke. "You saved him anyway." Tommy stepped forward, held out something. A small wooden carving. A bird. Roughly made, the wings uneven, but recognizable. "I made it," he said. "For you. Mama said you made me better when I was burning up. Said I would have died without you." Sarah took the carving. The wood was smooth, warm from the boy's hand, whittled careful despite the rough edges. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Pike's eyes were wet, tears tracking down her face. She didn't wipe them away. "I was wrong about you, about everything. You're decent. You're good. And She stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." The word hung in the air between them, heavy, real. Sarah looked at this woman who judged her, condemned her, made her feel small and shameful in front of the whole town, made her walk away from church with her face burning and her hands shaking. She could hold on to that, could nurse it like a wound, let it grow into something bitter and permanent, or she could let it go. "Tommy's a good boy," Sarah said. "I'm glad he's well." Mrs. Pike's face crumpled. She reached out, pulled Sarah into a brief, hard embrace. Sarah stiffened, then softened. Let it happen. Let this woman who'd been cruel hold her for 3 seconds, 4, then Mrs. Pike pulled back, wiped her face, nodded, turned away. Tommy stayed for a moment. "You really are good," he said, quiet, serious. "Mama cried for 3 days after you left our house, kept saying she was wrong. She was wrong, over and over." Then he ran after his mother. Sarah stood holding the wooden bird, feeling the weight of forgiveness. How heavy it was, how light it made her feel. Evening came soft and golden. The still room was finished. Complete. The men had cleaned up the sawdust, swept the floor with brooms made from bound straw, put the tools back in the wagons. Everything ready. Pastor Miller stood in the doorway, raised his hands. "Let us bless this place, where healing happens, where mercy dwells, where the sick find comfort and the suffering find relief." May the Lord's grace rest upon this room and all who work within it. Amen. Amen, everyone said together, the sound like a wave, breaking over her, settling. People started leaving, climbing into wagons, calling goodbyes. Children were tired, carried by their fathers, sleeping against their mothers' shoulders. Gifts remained, jars of preserves lined up on the new shelves, peach, strawberry, apple butter, a bolt of cloth, blue calico, a smoked ham wrapped in cheesecloth, small offerings, given freely, no strings attached. Sarah stood in the yard watching them go, Wade beside her, not speaking, just there, solid. The last wagon pulled away, disappeared down the road. The dust settled, hung in the golden light before falling. Silence. Sarah walked into the still room, stood in the center, turned slow, taking it in, the shelves, the table, the window letting in the last light of day, making everything glow amber and warm. Her hands started shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from something too big to name, too real to hold inside. "It's real," Sarah said. Her voice broke on the words. "They built this for me." Wade stood in the doorway, watching her, his face unreadable in the fading light. Sarah pressed her hand against her mouth again. The tears came, hot, fast, running down her face faster than she could stop them. She couldn't hold them back anymore. Didn't want to. Wade crossed the room in 3 steps, stood in front of her. Close. His hands at his sides, not reaching out. But there. Present. "Happy tears," Sarah said through her fingers, trying to explain. It's good. It's so good and I don't know what to do with it." Wade's hand came up. Slow. Careful. Wiped one tear from her cheek with his thumb. Gentle. Like she was something that might break. Sarah's breath caught. Stopped. Started again. His hand stayed there, cupped against her face. His palm warm, rough with calluses from years of hard work. His eyes on hers, dark, intent, something in them she'd never seen before, something that looked like he was deciding something, weighing it, choosing. "You deserve this," he said, voice low, rough. "You deserve good things." Sarah's hand came up, covered his, held it against her face, her fingers curling around his knuckles. They stood like that, not moving, not speaking, just breathing the same air in the still room that smelled of pine and new beginnings. Outside. The sun touched the horizon, spilled red and orange across the sky like something precious being poured out. Wade's thumb brushed her cheekbone. Once, twice, then his hand dropped. He stepped back, put space between them, cleared his throat. "Should get the lamps lit," he said. "Yes." He walked toward the door, stopped, turned back. "Sarah." She looked at him, waiting. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. Then he was gone. Out into the evening, leaving her standing there with her face still warm from his touch. Sarah pressed her own hand where his had been, felt the lingering heat, the impression of his palm against her skin. Something had changed between them, shifted. She didn't know what came next. Didn't know if Wade felt what she felt. Didn't know if this was allowed. If she was allowed to want this after everything. but standing in the still room the town had built for her, with the fading light painting everything gold. Sarah thought maybe she was allowed to want things again. Maybe she was allowed to hope for something more than just survival. That night, Sarah stood on her cottage porch. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't settle. Her mind kept going back to Wade's hand on her face, to the way he'd looked at her, to the 3 words he'd said before leaving. "I'm glad you stayed," across the yard. Wade's lamp was burning, that small yellow glow in the darkness, like always. She watched it, wondered if he was reading, or just sitting there unable to sleep like her. The lamp went out. Sarah waited, held her breath without knowing why. Wade's door opened. He stepped onto his porch, stood there in the darkness, looking toward her cottage. She could barely see him, just his silhouette against the house, tall, still, but she knew he was looking at her, knew he could see her standing there on her own porch. They stood like that, 40 yards apart, the night between them, neither moving, neither speaking. Then Wade raised his hand. Small wave. Sarah raised hers back. He went inside, closed his door. Sarah stood there for another minute, then went into her cottage, lay down on her rope bed, stared at the ceiling where the chamomile hung, and thought about a man who wiped tears from her face with work-rough hands and said she deserved good things, who'd sat by her bedside reading poetry while she slept, who'd waited outside a church for her and brought her terrible soup and left wildflowers in a tin can, and wondered what it meant that her heart beat faster when he was near, that her breath caught when their hands touched, that she felt safer with him than she'd ever felt with James, who'd promised her everything and given her nothing. Autumn came in shades of gold. The garden turned. The bean vines yellowed, their green fading to pale straw. The squash leaves went crisp at the edges, brown spreading from the veins outward like water stains on paper. The corn dried on the stalks, the ears hard, ready for harvest. Everything preparing to die so it could live again come spring. Sarah worked beside Wade, pulling spent plants, saving seeds, preparing the ground for the cold months ahead. Her hands moved through the dirt, pulling bean vines from their stakes, shaking the dried pods until the seeds rattled inside like small stones, breaking the pods open, pouring the seeds into paper packets she'd folded from old newspaper, writing the name on each one in careful script. Beans, Kentucky Wonder. Wade worked the rows beside her, his movements steady, patient, no wasted motion. He pulled squash vines, cut the dried gourds free, split them open with his knife, scooped the seeds into his palm, brought them to Sarah to sort and save. They didn't talk much, didn't need to, just worked. The rhythm of 2 people who'd learned each other's patterns, who knew when to step left, when to reach right, when to move aside so the other could pass. The seed packets piled up. Sarah labeled each one. Squash, Hubbard, corn, golden bantam, marigold, chamomile, feverfew. Next year's garden written in ink on brown paper. The sun moved lower, made their shadows long across the turned earth. The air was cooler now, September giving way to October, the heat finally breaking after months of drought and dust. "What about spring?" Wade asked. Didn't look up from the squash vine he was pulling. "What you planning to plant?" Sarah sat back on her heels, wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, left a streak of dirt she couldn't see. Same as this year, mostly. Maybe add some lettuce, radishes, things that come up early while it's still cool. Sounds good. The words were simple, but they meant something. Meant next spring. Meant she'd still be here. Meant permanence neither of them had named yet, but both understood. Sarah's hands went back to work. Pulling, sorting, saving seeds for a future that felt real now. Solid. Not just hope, but plan. The afternoon wore on, the sun slanted lower, painted everything amber and warm. The prairie grass turned gold in the light. Even the dust looked beautiful, like something precious instead of just dirt waiting for rain. Wade stood, brushed soil from his knees. The dirt had stained his trousers dark at the joints, ground in deep. Got something in the barn. Wait here. He walked away. Sarah watched him go, wondered what he was retrieving. He came back carrying a box. Small, wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. The package looked new, clean, out of place in his dirt-stained hands. Came in at the mercantile 2 weeks back, he said, held the box out to her. Ordered them special. From a catalog. Sarah took the box. Her fingers left smudges on the clean paper. She unwrapped it careful, untied the twine, folded back the brown wrapping. Inside tulip bulbs. Dozens of them. Each one wrapped in individual papers with descriptions written in printed script. Red emperor. Yellow parrot. Pink impression. White triumphator. Her breath caught, stopped in her throat. Wade, thought we could plant them, he said, not looking at her, looking at the ground, at the barn, at the fence line. For spring, they'll come up in April, maybe early May if we get a late spring. Sarah looked at the bulbs, at the promise of them, at flowers that wouldn't bloom for 6 months, maybe more. A lifetime in Nebraska where drought could kill everything, where nothing was certain, where planning that far ahead was an act of faith she wasn't sure she deserved to make. These are expensive, she said. Her voice came out rough. Yeah. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Sarah looked at him then. Really looked. His face was turned away, his jaw tight, the muscle jumping in his cheek like it did when he was holding something back. When he was trying to say something, he didn't have words for. Help me plant them, he asked, voice quiet, almost lost in the prairie wind. Sarah nodded. Couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. They worked as the sun went down. Wade dug the holes with the garden fork, 6 inches deep, measured careful with his hand. Sarah placed the bulbs, pointed end up, the way her mother had taught her, covered them with earth, patted it down firm but gentle. Each bulb was an act of faith, a promise to the future, to spring, to blooms they'd see together. The light turned gold, then orange, then red, like something burning at the edge of the world. Wade's hands worked beside hers, both of them in the dirt, both of them planting things that wouldn't grow for months. That required them to believe in April, when October was barely here. These'll come up in April, Wade said, his voice quiet, careful, like he was testing the words. Maybe early May, if the spring comes late. He stopped, his hand still in the soil. A bulb balanced on his palm, waiting to be planted. Would you He cleared his throat. Started again. Would you stay, not just for the garden, for... He didn't finish. Couldn't seem to find the words. Or maybe the words he had weren't the right ones. Sarah's hand moved, covered his in the soil, both of them holding earth and bulbs and promises unspoken. I'm home. Wade, she said. Simple. True. The only words that mattered. I'm already home. Wade's fingers curled around hers, squeezed. Earth caked between their palms, dirt under their nails. 2 pairs of hands joined in the ground where things grew. Yeah, he said. Rough. Quiet. Like the word cost him something. You are. They planted the last bulbs as the sun touched the horizon, worked in silence that meant more than words. Their shadows stretched long and parallel across the garden. 2 dark shapes on golden earth, moving together, separate but joined. When the last bulb was buried, Wade sat back, looked at the turned earth, at the places where flowers would come in spring, at the promise hidden underground waiting for warmth. Daffodils, too, he said. Ordered those. They're still at the mercantile. We can get them next week when we go for supplies. Daffodils and tulips. Maybe some crocuses, if you want. They come up earliest, before the snow's even gone sometimes. I want... Wade stood, held out his hand. Sarah took it. Let him pull her up. They stood in the garden with dirt on their hands, and their clothes and their faces, the last light painting everything the color of honey. Thank you, Sarah said. For the bulbs. For staying. For being the kind of man who planted flowers for a future he couldn't see yet but believed in anyway. For asking her to stay. For making her feel like she belonged somewhere. Like she was enough. Wade nodded. Didn't let go of her hand right away. Held it for 3 heartbeats. 4. Then released. Come on, I'll make coffee. Your coffee's terrible. I know, but it's what I got. They walked across the yard together. Not hand in hand. That would have been too much. Too soon. But close. Side by side. Leaving footprints in the dust. 2 people who'd been broken finding a way to be whole. Behind them, the garden rested. Seeds tucked safe in packets labeled in Sarah's careful handwriting. Bulbs buried in earth waiting for spring. Everything sleeping. Everything promised to wake again. The prairie wind picked up, blew across the land. Carried the smell of turned earth and coming rain and possibility. At Wade's house, he built up the fire in the stove, put the coffee pot on to boil. Sarah sat at his table. The first time she'd sat here. The first time she'd been inside since that night weeks ago when she couldn't sleep, and had almost crossed a line neither of them was ready for yet. But this was different. This was daylight. This was after planting bulbs together. This was after he'd asked her to stay and she'd said she was home. Wade poured 2 cups, brought them to the table, sat across from her. His hands wrapped around the tin cup like he needed something to hold on to. They drank terrible coffee and watched the last light fade through the window, orange turning to purple, turning to blue. Stars starting to show. Faint at first. Then brighter. April's a long way off, Sarah said. Wade nodded, took a sip, made a face at his own coffee. Yeah, it is. We'll need to tend them. The bulbs, Keep the ground from freezing too hard. Maybe cover them with straw when the cold comes. Yeah, and the garden. We'll need to turn the soil again before the ground freezes. Get it ready for spring planting. We got time, Wade said, looked at her over his cup, his eyes steady. Sure. We got all the time we need. Sarah's chest felt tight, but in a good way. In a way that felt like hope instead of fear. They finished their coffee as the darkness settled, the lamp burning between them on the table, throwing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel smaller, more intimate. When the cups were empty, Sarah stood. I should go. Wade stood too, walked her to the door, opened it. The night air was cool, crisp, smelling of autumn and wood smoke from someone's fire down the road. Sarah. She turned, looked at him, his face half in shadow, half in lamplight. Thank you, he said, for staying, for everything. Thank you for asking. He nodded, stood there in the doorway until she reached her cottage, until she turned and waved, until she went inside and closed her door. Sarah stood in her dark cottage, didn't light her lamp right away, just stood at the window and looked across the yard at Wade's house, at the lamp burning in his window, at the promise of bulbs in the ground and seeds saved for planting and spring coming, whether they were ready or not. She was home, not the home she'd left in Ohio, not the home James had promised and taken away, but this. Wade's ranch with its dead garden come back to life, its still room that smelled of pine and herbs, its quiet man who said more with silence than most people said with words. This was home. And for the first time since she'd stood in that mercantile counting pennies for bread, Sarah believed she deserved it. There's something quiet that settles in when we watch two people find each other, not through grand moments, but through the small ones we almost miss. The flour sack left without a name, the terrible coffee made with shaking hands. The bulbs planted for a spring, neither of them was certain they'd see together. Many of us know what it feels like to be told we're not enough, to carry that around like stones in our pockets, making every step harder. We know the particular weight of being judged by people who see only the surface and decide they understand everything beneath. Some of us have stood in places where we didn't belong and wondered if we ever would. Perhaps you've felt it too, that moment when someone looks past what others say about you and sees something true. When rough hands touch your face with unexpected gentleness, when you realize home isn't always the place you left behind, but sometimes the place you build from turned earth and shared silence. This story doesn't wrap up cleanly. Sarah and Wade's future isn't written in certainty, only in bulbs buried 6 inches deep and seeds saved in packets with careful labels. Some things are allowed to remain unfinished. Some endings are really beginnings. We're just learning to trust. Thank you for sitting with this, for staying through the uncertain parts and the tender parts alike.